They say the devil is in the details, but sometimes the devil is sitting right across from you at the dinner table. Richard Sterling thought he had committed the perfect crime. He had the money, the mistress, and the ruthless lawyer to ensure his quiet, unassuming wife, Alice, would walk away from their 10-year marriage with absolutely nothing. He was celebrating his victory before the gavel even fell. But Richard made one fatal mistake. He never bothered to ask about his wife's past. And when the judge finally asked the question that changed everything, "Who is your wife's father?" the silence in the courtroom was louder than a scream. This is the story of how a man who wanted everything lost the only thing that actually mattered. Richard Sterling adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Armani suit, catching his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. Seattle lay sprawled beneath him, a grid of grey and glass that he felt he personally owned. At 42, Richard was the face of Sterling Developments, a real estate empire that had reshaped the Pacific Northwest. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with silver-flecked hair and eyes that assessed the value of everything they touched. Sitting on the leather sofa behind him was Jessica Vane. She wasn't just his corporate attorney. She was the woman he intended to marry as soon as the ink was dry on his divorce papers. Jessica was everything his current wife, Alice, was not. Ambitious, loud, terrifyingly smart, and obsessed with status. "Are you sure the offshore accounts are untraceable?" Jessica asked, swirling the ice in her tumbler of scotch. "If Alice gets a forensic accountant—" Richard laughed, a dry, barking sound. "Alice? A forensic accountant?" "Jessica, the woman clips coupons for groceries, even though I give her a 5-figure allowance. She thinks the Cayman Islands is a brand of salad dressing. She has no idea what I'm worth, and she certainly doesn't have the spine to fight for it." It was true. For the last decade, Alice Miller, now Alice Sterling, had been the invisible woman. Richard had met her in a library where she worked as an archivist. She was quiet, plain, and painfully agreeable. In the beginning, that was what Richard wanted. He needed a stable, boring background character while he clawed his way to the top. She hosted his dinners, ironed his shirts, and never asked why he came home at 3 a.m. smelling of strange perfume. But Richard had outgrown her. He was a shark, she was a goldfish, and sharks need to keep moving. "The prenup is 10 years old, Richard," Jessica warned, though she smiled. "Judges in this state can be fickle with long-term marriages. Alimony is a real threat." "Not if she cheated," Richard said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Did she?" "No," Richard smirked. "But by the time we're done with the falsified texts and the witness testimony from the pool boy I fired last month, she'll be lucky to leave with the clothes on her back. I'm taking the house, the cars, the portfolio, and the dog. She's going to be back in that library, stacking books before the summer ends." They clinked glasses. It was a celebration of cruelty. They weren't just planning a divorce, they were planning an annihilation. Richard drove home that night to the sprawling estate in Medina, a neighborhood where Bill Gates might be a neighbor. The house was dark. Alice was likely already in bed or reading in the sunroom. He found her in the kitchen, making tea. She wore a faded cardigan that was at least 5 years old. Her hair, a mousy brown, was pulled back in a messy bun. She looked up as he entered, her blue eyes soft and tired. "Richard?" she said softly. "You're late. I kept dinner warm." He didn't answer. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out the manila envelope. He tossed it onto the marble island. It slid across the surface and stopped right next to her mug of chamomile tea. "What is this?" she asked. "Freedom," Richard said cold. For me. It's over, Alice. I'm filing for divorce. And I'm filing for fault. Alice stared at the envelope. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the tea in his face. She didn't even cry. She just stood there, her hands gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. Fault? She whispered. What did I do? It's not about what you did, Alice. It's about who you are. You're insufficient. Richard leaned in, enjoying the power of the moment. I have the best lawyers in the city. Jessica Vane is handling the case personally. If you try to fight this, if you try to touch my money, I will bury you in legal fees until you are homeless. Sign the papers, take the $50,000 settlement I'm offering, and disappear. Alice looked down at the envelope, then back up at him. For a split second, Richard thought he saw something flash in her eyes. Not fear, but something colder. Something like pity. $50,000, she repeated. For 10 years. Take it or leave it. I'll need time to read it, she said, her voice steady again. You have until Monday, Richard snapped. He turned on his heel and walked out, heading to the guest room. He didn't see Alice open the envelope. He didn't see her read the accusations of adultery he had fabricated. And he certainly didn't see her pick up her phone, dial a number from memory, and say 4 words that would seal his fate. Daddy, it's happening. Now. The 3 months leading up to the trial were surprisingly quiet. Richard expected hysteria. He expected Alice to beg, to plead, or to show up at his office causing a scene. He wanted that. He wanted the validation that he was the prize she was losing. Instead, she vanished from the house. She moved into a small apartment downtown and communicated only via email. She hasn't hired a lawyer yet, Jessica told Richard one afternoon, looking at her tablet with a frown. The court date is in 2 weeks. If she doesn't have representation, the judge might grant a continuance. I don't want to wait. She's probably going to represent herself, Richard scoffed, signing a check for a new Porsche he was buying for Jessica. She's arrogant enough to think her innocence matters in a court of law. Let her. It'll be a slaughter. Richard spent those 3 months moving assets. He wasn't stupid. He knew forensic accounting existed. But he had been preparing for this for years. He had shell companies in Delaware, accounts in the Cook Islands, and cryptocurrency wallets that no one knew the keys to. On paper, Sterling Developments was struggling. On paper, Richard was barely making ends meet due to market volatility. In reality, he was richer than he had ever been. The strategy was simple. Claim poverty to avoid alimony, claim adultery to void the prenup's fidelity clause, and claim emotional distress to keep the assets. 1 week before the trial, a response finally came from Alice's side. Jessica stormed into Richard's office, looking confused. We got a filing from Alice. And? It's weird. It's not a countersuit. It's just a list of stipulations. She's agreeing to the divorce. She's not contesting the house. She's not asking for spousal support. Richard stopped typing. She's giving up? Basically, Jessica said, pacing the room. But there's one thing she is contesting, one single asset. Which one? The condo in Aspen? The yacht? No. Jessica looked at the paper, squinting. The plot of land in rural Montana. The one with the dilapidated cabin you bought 5 years ago for that hunting trip you never went on. Richard racked his brain. He remembered the place. Blackwood Creek. He had bought 500 acres of useless scrubland for dirt cheap during a tax auction, thinking he might develop it one day. He hadn't thought about it since. The value was negligible compared to his Seattle portfolio. She wants the dirt patch? Richard laughed. Why? It says here, sentimental value related to childhood memories. She's never been to Montana. Richard roared with laughter. God, she's pathetic. She's trying to hold on to something, just to feel like she won a victory. Fine. Let her have the cabin. It's worth maybe 200 grand. If that's the price of getting rid of her, give it to her. Wait, Jessica said, her lawyer instincts twitching. Why would she trade a potential $5 million in alimony for a $200,000 plot of land? It doesn't make sense, Richard. Is there gold on that land? Oil? It's dirt and pine trees, Jessica. I had it surveyed. It's worthless. I don't like it, Jessica muttered. I'm going to depose her. I want to look her in the eye before we agree to anything. The deposition was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday. Richard and Jessica sat on one side of the long mahogany table in Jessica's high-rise conference room. The camera was rolling. Alice entered. She looked different. The cardigan was gone. She was wearing a simple, dark navy suit. It wasn't expensive, probably off the rack, but it fit her differently. Her posture was straighter. She carried a single thin file folder, and she was alone. Miss Miller, Jessica started, using her maiden name to be petty. Where is your legal counsel? I am representing myself, Alice said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the tremor Richard was used to. Very well. Jessica smiled the smile of a wolf looking at a lamb. Let's begin. For 4 hours, Jessica grilled Alice. She asked humiliating questions about their marriage, about the fabricated affair, about her spending habits. Richard watched, expecting Alice to crack. He wanted tears. But Alice answered every question with a simple yes, no, or I do not recall. She was a stone wall. Finally, Jessica slammed her hand on the table. Ms. Miller, you are agreeing to waive all rights to the marital home, the stock portfolio, and alimony in exchange for a cabin in Montana. Is that correct? That is correct, Alice said. Why? Jessica pressed. Are you aware that Mr. Sterling's assets are valued in the tens of millions? I am aware of what Richard says his assets are valued at, Alice corrected gently. Richard stiffened. What does that mean? Jessica snapped. It means, Alice looked directly at Richard for the first time, that I just want to be done. I want the cabin because I like the quiet. I want out of this toxic environment. If giving him the money buys my peace, then it is a bargain. Richard smiled. She was weak. She was running away. Fine, Jessica said, closing her folder. We'll draw up the agreement, but we're still going to court. Richard wants the judgment on public record. He wants the adultery finding to ensure you can't come back and sue for defamation later. I understand, Alice said. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. See you in court, Richard. As she walked out, Richard felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. It felt too easy. But then he remembered the bank accounts in the Caymans, the hidden ledgers, the foolproof plan. She's an idiot, Richard said, loosening his tie. We won? Jessica wasn't smiling. She was staring at the door Alice had just walked through. Richard, did you notice something? What? Her file folder, Jessica said. She never opened it. Not once. Why bring a file you don't intend to use? Maybe it was empty, Richard shrugged. Just a prop to make herself look prepared. They left the office, heading to a celebratory dinner at Canlis. They ordered champagne and laughed about the Montana cabin. They didn't know that the file folder wasn't empty, and they didn't know that the man presiding over their case, Judge Harrison, had just received a phone call from a very old, very powerful friend in Washington, D.C. The morning of the trial, the sky over Seattle was a bruised purple, threatening a storm that refused to break. Richard Sterling stood on the steps of the King County Superior Court, smoking a cigar. It was a violation of local ordinances, but Richard didn't care. He felt invincible. He flicked the ash onto the concrete as Jessica walked up the steps, struggling with 3 massive banker's boxes of documents. "You look tense, darling," Richard smirked. "I'm focused," Jessica corrected, her heels clicking sharply on the stone. "Judge Harrison is old school. He doesn't like theatrics, but he respects preparation. I have 500 pages here detailing Alice's financial incompetence and the affidavits regarding her infidelity. We are going to paint a picture of a woman who was a burden on your brilliance." "She was a burden," Richard said, checking his Rolex. "Let's go get this over with. I have a tea time at 2 set." The courtroom was cold, smelling of floor wax and old wood. It was mostly empty, save for the bailiff, the court reporter, and a few bored clerks. When Alice arrived, she entered through the back doors silently. She wore the same navy suit from the deposition. She carried no boxes, no evidence, just that single, thin file folder. She sat at the defendant's table alone. She didn't look at Richard. She stared straight ahead at the empty judge's bench, her hands folded on the table. "Look at her," Richard whispered to Jessica, leaning back in his chair. "She looks like a child waiting for the principal. It's almost sad." "Don't get cocky yet," Jessica whispered back, arranging her pens in a perfect row. "Just stick to the script. You were the provider. She was the leech." "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Harrison entered. He was a man in his late 60s with a face carved from granite and eyes that seemed to have seen every lie humanity had to offer. He sat down heavily, adjusting his robes, and peered over his reading glasses at the 2 tables. "Case number 49201, Sterling versus Sterling," the judge grumbled. "We are here to finalize the dissolution of marriage and the division of assets. I see the petitioner is represented by Ms. Vane. The respondent is appearing pro se?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alice said. Her voice was clear, carrying to the back of the room without effort. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Harrison said, using her married name deliberately. "You understand that your husband has high-powered counsel. You are entitled to a lawyer. Proceeding without one in a high-asset divorce is generally considered unwise." "I understand, Your Honor. I do not believe this will take long." Richard stifled a laugh. Jessica kicked him under the table. The proceedings began exactly as Richard had hoped. Jessica Vane was a shark in the water. She stood up and delivered an opening statement that was a work of fiction, so compelling Richard almost believed it himself. "Your Honor," Jessica said, pacing before the bench. "Richard Sterling is a man who built an empire from nothing. He worked 80-hour weeks while his wife sat at home, contributing nothing to the marital estate. And how did she repay him? With coldness, with distance, and as the evidence will show, with infidelity." Jessica presented the fabricated text messages. She presented the sworn statement from the fired pool boy, a man Richard had paid $10,000 to lie. She presented financial records, carefully doctored, showing that Sterling Developments was on the brink of collapse and that Richard was practically destitute despite his lifestyle. Throughout it all, Alice sat motionless. She didn't object. She didn't shake her head. She just watched. When it was Richard's turn to testify, he played the part of the heartbroken, overworked husband perfectly. "I gave her everything," Richard said, looking at the jury box, which was empty as this was a bench trial with a practiced, soulful gaze. "I bought her cars she didn't drive. I sent her on vacations she didn't enjoy. I just wanted a partner. Instead, I got a roommate who spent my money." "And your assets, Mr. Sterling?" Jessica asked. "Can you tell the court the current state of your finances?" "It's bad," Richard lied smoothly. "The market has turned. The company is leveraged to the hilt. Honestly, the settlement I offered her, $50,000, is money I'll have to borrow. But I want to be fair. Judge Harrison was taking notes. He looked up. Ms. Sterling, do you wish to cross-examine the witness? Richard braced himself. This was it. She would scream. She would accuse him of hiding the offshore accounts. Alice stood up. No questions, Your Honor. The silence in the room was heavy. Jessica blinked, visibly confused. Richard frowned. No questions? She was letting him get away with perjury without a fight? Ms. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, his brow furrowing. You understand that by not challenging this testimony, you are accepting it as fact for the record. I accept that Mr. Sterling believes what he is saying is necessary, Alice said cryptically. Very well, the judge said. He looked suspicious, but he moved the proceedings along. By noon, Jessica rested her case. They had successfully argued that Richard was broke, Alice was a cheater, and the prenup should be enforced strictly. Your turn, Miss Sterling, the judge said, looking at the clock. Call your witnesses. I have no witnesses, Your Honor, Alice said. Do you have evidence to present? Just one document, Alice said. She picked up the file folder. But I would like to submit it during my closing statement, if it pleases the court. That is highly irregular. Jessica stood up, objecting immediately. We haven't had a chance to review it during discovery. It is a public record, Alice said calmly. It requires no discovery. Judge Harrison looked at Alice for a long moment. It was as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. Finally he nodded. I'll allow it. Proceed. The courtroom air had grown stale. Richard was bored. He was already mentally spending the money he had saved today. He'd buy the yacht. He'd name it the Alimony. Alice walked to the center of the room. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Richard. For the first time in 10 years, he saw something in her face that terrified him. It wasn't anger. It was total, absolute indifference. It was the look a boot gives to an ant. Your Honor, Alice began, I am not here to argue about who was a better spouse. Richard wants a divorce. I grant him that. Richard wants to keep his company. I grant him that. Richard claims he has no money. I will not argue with him. She paused, walking over to the defense table and placing her hand on the map of the Montana property Jessica had entered into evidence earlier. My husband and his lawyer have spent 4 hours detailing why I deserve nothing. They have argued that I am insufficient. They have argued that I have no family, no connections, and no value. She picked up the map. We have agreed, in principle, that I will walk away with this single asset. Lot 4B, Blackwood Creek, Montana. 500 acres of undeveloped scrubland. Valuation, $185,000. She turned to the judge. I am ready to sign the decree, Your Honor, on the condition that this land is awarded to me, fully and irrevocably, effective immediately. Jessica stood up. Your Honor, the petitioner has already agreed to this. We are happy to unload this worthless asset to the respondent. Judge Harrison held up a hand to silence Jessica. He wasn't looking at the lawyers anymore. He was looking at the paperwork in front of him. He flipped a page, then another. He adjusted his glasses. He picked up a specific document, the deed to the Montana land. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said. His voice had changed. It was no longer the bored drawl of a bureaucrat. It was sharp, like a whip crack. Richard sat up straighter. Yes, Your Honor? You purchased this land 5 years ago from a state auction. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Tax seizure. And you have never visited it? No, sir. It's in the middle of nowhere. And you believe it to be worthless? It's dirt and rocks, Judge. Maybe some timber, but nothing worth the logging costs. Judge Harrison leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "And you, Miss Vane, you are a diligent attorney. Did you run a title search on the mineral rights of this land?" Jessica hesitated. "Standard procedure, Your Honor. Surface rights only. The mineral rights were severed in the 1920s. "Correct," the judge said. "They were severed." The judge turned his gaze to Alice. "Mrs. Sterling, why do you want this land?" Alice smiled. It was a small, sad smile. "Because, Your Honor, it's the only place Richard never touched, and because of who owned it before the state seized it." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. He closed the file folder in front of him. The room went deathly silent. The judge took off his glasses and looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, you have come into my courtroom, insulted the intelligence of this bench with falsified financial statements. Yes, I know they are falsified. Don't look so shocked. And attempted to defraud your wife." "Objection!" Jessica shrieked. "That is prejudicial." "Sit down, counselor," Harrison roared. The sound echoed off the wood paneling. "I am not done." He turned back to Richard. "You thought you were the predator here, son. You thought you picked a weak, lonely librarian with no background. You thought you could discard her like trash." Richard's heart started to hammer against his ribs. "I don't understand. What is this about?" "This is about the one question you never asked," the judge said softly. "In 10 years of marriage, you never asked about her people. You never asked about her history." The judge leaned over the bench, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "Mr. Sterling, do you know who your wife's father is?" Richard looked at Alice. She was just standing there, serene. I assumed he was dead," Richard stammered. "She said he worked for the government." "He did," Judge Harrison said. "He worked for the government in the same way a nuclear bomb works for the government." The judge pointed a finger at Alice. "That woman is the only daughter of Director William Wild Bill Halloway." Jessica Vane gasped loudly. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. She dropped her pen. It clattered on the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. Richard looked from Jessica to the judge, confused. "Halloway! Who is Halloway?" Jessica grabbed Richard's arm, her nails digging into his expensive suit. "Richard!" she hissed, her voice trembling. Shut up right now." "Who is he?" Richard demanded. "William Halloway," the judge continued, his voice dripping with icy reverence, "was the director of the CIA for 12 years. Before that, he ran Black Ops logistics for the Pentagon. He is a man who topples governments before breakfast, and he is a man who values privacy above all else." The judge opened the file Alice had placed on the bench, the one she asked to submit. "This document," the judge said, tapping it, "is a copy of the original trust deed for the land in Montana. It wasn't just seized for taxes. It was seized because the shell company hiding it forgot to pay the bill. That land is the entrance point to the Blackwood repository." Richard blinked. "A repository? Like storage?" "Not storage, you idiot," Jessica whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's a decommissioned Cold War bunker. Halloway bought it in the 90s. "Correct," the judge said. "But it's not just a bunker. It is where the Halloway Family Trust is physically located. Not in a bank. Not in the Caymans. In the ground." The judge looked at Alice with new respect. "Mrs. Sterling is asking for the land because, according to this deed, whoever holds the surface rights controls the access road, and without that access road, the vault underneath, containing, I assume, the substantial Halloway inheritance, is inaccessible." Richard's mouth fell open. "Inheritance? How much?" Alice spoke up then. Her voice was soft, but it cut through Richard like a blade. My father didn't believe in banks, Richard. He didn't trust digital currency. He trusted gold and art and bearer bonds. She paused. The current valuation of the contents of the Blackwood vault is approximately $400 million. Richard felt the room spin. 400 million. He was fighting for a few million in hidden assets, while she was sitting on $500 million. And, Alice continued, her eyes hardening, you just agreed, on public record under oath, to give me that land. You called it worthless. You fought to make sure I took it instead of your precious construction company. No, Richard stood up, panic rising in his throat. No, I didn't know. That's fraud. She hid assets. I hid nothing, Alice said coldly. The land was in your name, Richard. You bought it. You owned it. You just never bothered to look at what it was. You were too busy hiding your own pennies to realize you were holding a winning lottery ticket. Your Honor, Jessica shouted, desperate now. We moved to rescind the agreement. There was a lack of informed consent. The petitioner was unaware of the asset's true value. Judge Harrison smiled. It was a terrifying smile. Miss Vane, you spent the last 4 hours arguing that Mr. Sterling is a brilliant businessman who knows every inch of his portfolio. You argued that Miss Sterling is incompetent. You cannot flip the script now just because you realized you made a bad deal. You wanted the fault judgment? You wanted strict adherence to the contract? The judge raised his gavel. Judgment is found in favor of the respondent, Alice Sterling. The marital assets will be divided as requested by the petitioner. Mr. Sterling keeps his business and his debts. Miss Sterling takes the Montana property. Wait! Richard screamed, lunging toward the bench. The bailiff stepped forward, hand on his taser. She played me. She set me up. She didn't set you up, Richard, Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low growl. She just let you be yourself, and I suggest you sit down, because I have one more thing to tell you about your father-in-law. Richard froze. Director Halloway passed away 3 months ago, the judge said. That's why Ms. Sterling filed her response when she did. She is now the sole executor of his estate. But Director Halloway had friends, very powerful friends. One of them. Judge Harrison leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. One of them is the Attorney General of the United States, and another one happens to be the head of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The judge picked up the falsified financial records Richard had submitted earlier. And do you know what Director Halloway hated more than anything? Liars. I received a call this morning, Mr. Sterling. The IRS is very interested in those offshore accounts you mentioned to your mistress, but forgot to tell the court about. The back doors of the courtroom opened. 3 men in dark suits walked in. They wore windbreakers with yellow letters on the back. FBI. Richard Sterling looked at Alice. She hadn't moved. She was watching him with that same terrible indifference. Who is your wife's father? Alice whispered, repeating the question. You should have asked, Richard. You really should have asked. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut is a distinct, mechanical finality that no amount of money can muffle. In the high-ceilinged courtroom of King County Superior Court, that clicking sound seemed to echo off the mahogany walls, bouncing between the shocked silence of the clerks and the heavy breathing of Richard Sterling. Richard stood, his arms wrenched behind his back, his face pressed against the polished wood of the defense table, where, moments ago, he had been celebrating his cleverness. You can't do this, Richard shouted, his voice cracking. He twisted his head to look for his lawyer. Jessica, do something. Call the firm. Jessica Vane was already halfway to the gallery railing, stuffing her files into her bag with frantic, shaking hands. She didn't look at Richard. She looked at the FBI agents, her eyes wide with self-preservation. "I am not his counsel for criminal matters," Jessica stammered to the lead agent, a tall man with a scar running through his eyebrow. "I represent him solely in family court. I had no knowledge of his tax filings. I am a victim of his deception as much as anyone else." "Jessica!" Richard screamed, the betrayal cutting deeper than the metal cuffs. "We planned this. You set up the Delaware shells." "I did no such thing," Jessica shrieked back, her voice shrill. "I advised you on legal asset protection. If you used those vehicles for fraud, that is on you, Mr. Sterling. Don't you dare drag me down with you." She turned and practically ran out of the courtroom, the click-clack of her heels sounding like a panicked heartbeat. Judge Harrison watched the scene from the bench, his face unreadable. He slowly removed his glasses and began to polish them with a cloth. He looked at Alice, who was still standing at her table. "Ms. Sterling," the judge said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Or should I say, Ms. Halloway? You are free to go. The bailiff will have your decree stamped within the hour." "Thank you, Your Honor," Alice said. She picked up her single-file folder. As the agents hauled Richard toward the side exit, the perp walk door, he locked eyes with Alice. He expected to see triumph. He expected her to laugh. But Alice just looked at him with a profound, exhausting sadness. "Why?" Richard croaked, tears of rage and confusion finally spilling over. "Why didn't you just tell me? We could have ruled this city." Alice paused. She walked over to him, signaling the agents to wait for a second. The lead agent nodded deferentially, a sign of respect not for her, but for the ghost of the father she represented. "Because, Richard," Alice whispered, close enough that only he could hear, "my father didn't build his empire by taking things from people. He built it by protecting things. You never wanted a partner. You wanted an accessory. If I had told you about the money, you wouldn't have loved me. You would have just loved the vault." She stepped back. "Goodbye, Richard. Get him out of here," the lead agent commanded. The next 48 hours were a blur of fluorescent lights, cold concrete, and the humiliating stripping away of Richard Sterling's identity. His bespoke suit was replaced by an orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent and other men's sweat. His Rolex was catalogued in a plastic baggie. His identity as a CEO was replaced by a booking number. The interrogation room was small and airless. Across the metal table sat Agent Miller, the man with the scar, and a woman from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division named Special Agent Kovach. "Let's talk about the Sterling Growth Fund in the Cook Islands," Agent Kovach said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the table. Richard tried to muster his old arrogance. "I have rights. I want a lawyer." "You have a public defender arriving in 20 minutes, Agent Miller said calmly. "Your personal assets have been frozen under the RICO Act, pending investigation into money laundering. No private firm is going to touch you without a retainer you can't pay." "Money laundering?" Richard laughed nervously. "I evaded some taxes. Maybe. That's a fine. A slap on the wrist." "Mr. Sterling," Agent Miller leaned forward, "do you know who the primary investor in your blind trust was? Some venture capital group out of Macau. Red Dragon Holdings or something. It was just anonymous capital." "It was the Sinaloa cartel," Miller said flatly. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "You were washing drug money," Kovach added, tapping the paper. "And you were doing it badly. Director Halloway knew about it 3 years ago. He was building a file. He was letting you run just enough rope to hang yourself, and more importantly, to lead him to your contacts. My wife's father knew?" "He knew everything," Miller said. "He was going to take you down quietly. But then he died, And when you decided to humiliate his daughter in court? Well, let's just say the dead man's switch was activated. Every server you own was mirrored to the FBI this morning. Richard put his head in his hands. He realized then the true scale of his mistake. He hadn't just fought a divorce case. He had walked blindfolded into a minefield laid by a man who toppled regimes for a living. Outside the station, the news vans were already swarming. The headline on the Seattle Times website read, "Sterling Empire Crumbles, Real Estate Mogul Linked to Cartel Money Laundering in Shocking Divorce Twist." And in a small, quiet apartment downtown, Jessica Vane was pouring a drink, staring at her phone. Her partners had just voted to suspend her from the firm. The Bar Association had already opened an inquiry. She had survived Richard's fall, but she was radioactive. The King of Seattle was dead, and his queen had never been who they thought she was. 2 weeks later, a black Range Rover wound its way up a gravel switchback road deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. The air was thin and crisp, smelling of pine resin and snow. Alice sat in the driver's seat. She was alone. She had sold the Mercedes Richard had bought her, the one she hated because it was too flashy, and bought this sturdy, practical vehicle. In the back seat sat a golden retriever puppy she had named Judge. The GPS on the dashboard simply showed a blank green grid. The road she was on didn't exist on public maps. She crested a ridge and saw it. The worthless cabin. It was exactly as Richard had described it. A dilapidated log structure with a sagging porch, surrounded by scrub brush and aggressive weeds. It looked like a stiff wind would knock it over. Alice parked and stepped out. The silence was immense. It wasn't the empty silence of a lonely apartment. It was the majestic, heavy silence of nature. She walked up the rotting steps of the porch. She didn't use a key. Instead, she reached under a loose floorboard near the doorframe and found a rusty keypad embedded in the wood. She typed in a code, Woforta 19 Hohor 1978, her birthday. There was a heavy thunk deep underground, like the sound of a submarine door sealing. The front door of the cabin clicked open. Inside the cabin was a shell. There was no furniture, just dust and cobwebs. But in the center of the floor, the rug had been pulled back to reveal a gleaming steel seam in the floorboards. The floor hissed and slid open, revealing a staircase descending into cool, blue-lit darkness. Alice walked down. The air changed instantly, filtered, temperature-controlled, sterile. At the bottom of the stairs was a door made of blast-proof steel, 3 feet thick. It scanned her retina and recognized her gait before she even reached the handle. "Welcome, Director Holloway," a computerized voice said. "Correction. Welcome, Executor Alice." The door swung open. The Blackwood repository was not a pile of gold bars like in a pirate movie. It was something far more impressive. It was a command center. Rows of server racks hummed along one wall. A living area, Spartan but comfortable, occupied the corner, and in the center, a large mahogany desk, the same desk her father had used in his study in Virginia. On the desk sat a single envelope with her name on it. Alice sat down in her father's chair. It still smelled like his pipe tobacco. Her hands trembled as she opened the letter. "My dearest Alice, if you are reading this, 2 things have happened. First, I am gone. Second, you have finally left that impressive idiot you married. I know you never liked my work. You hated the secrets. You hated the bodyguards. You wanted a simple life, and I respected that. It's why I never intervened with Richard, even when I saw what a hollow man he was. You had to see it for yourself. But I also knew that the world is unkind to gentle people. Wolves like Richard will always try to eat sheep like you. unless the sheep turns out to be a lion. The assets in this vault are not just financial. Yes, there are bearer bonds and gold in the safe to your left, enough to fund your library for 1,000 years. But the servers contain the insurance files I kept from my time at the agency. Leverage on powerful men who think they are untouchable. I never used them. I kept them to ensure no one would ever come after us. They are yours now. Destroy them, publish them, or ignore them. It is your choice. You are the daughter of Wild Bill. You are stronger than you think. Enjoy the silence, kiddo. Love, Dad. Alice put the letter down. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and fast. She had spent 10 years making herself small to fit into Richard's life. She had dimmed her light so he could shine. And all the while, her father had been watching, waiting, and preparing a kingdom for her to rule when she was ready. She stood up and walked to the wall safe. She spun the dial. Inside, stacked in neat rows, were bars of gold bullion and stacks of bonds. But tucked in the back was a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside was a simple silver locket. She opened the locket. It was a picture of her mother, who had died when Alice was a baby, and a tiny inscription, Veritas Vincit, Truth Conquers. Alice closed the locket and put it around her neck. She felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. She walked over to the server bank. The screens were flickering with data streams. These were the secrets of senators, generals, and CEOs. It was enough power to burn Washington, D.C. to the ground. Alice looked at the glowing "Delete All" prompt on the master terminal. Her father had given her a weapon. She reached out and typed a command. Initiating data wipe. She watched the progress bar. 10%, 40%, 80%, 100%. System purged. Alice smiled. She didn't want the power. She didn't want the leverage. That was Richard's game. That was her father's game. She wanted the library. She wanted the quiet. She wanted the land. She walked back up the stairs, leaving the gold and the empty servers in the dark. She emerged into the Montana sunlight. The puppy, Judge, was chasing a butterfly in the tall grass. Alice took a deep breath of the mountain air. It tasted like freedom. 1 year later, the Federal Correctional Facility in Sheridan, Oregon, was a world stripped of color. It was a kaleidoscope of concrete gray, steel silver, and the faded, humiliating orange of the jumpsuits. For Richard Sterling, a man who once debated the nuances of crema on his espresso, the sensory deprivation was a torture worse than the confinement itself. He had aged a decade in 12 months. His silver-flecked hair, once his crowning glory, was now white and thinning, chopped brutally short by the prison barber. His skin, deprived of expensive moisturizers and sunlight, was sallow and papery. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The predator's glint was gone, replaced by a permanent, darting flinch, the look of a man who knew he was no longer at the top of the food chain. Richard sat in the corner of the recreation yard, shivering in the damp Oregon chill. He kept to himself. The other inmates knew who he was, the cartel accountant. It wasn't a title that earned respect. It earned him unwanted attention. He had learned quickly that his net worth here was zero. His connections were dead. Jessica Vane had testified against him to secure full immunity. She was currently working as a paralegal in a strip mall in Tacoma, disgraced but free, while Richard rotted. "Sterling!" a guard shouted, the voice echoing off the perimeter walls. Richard jumped, his heart hammering. "Yes? Visitor. Gate 3. Richard blinked. A visitor? He hadn't had a visitor in 6 months. His friends from the country club had evaporated the moment the FBI raided his office. His business partners were busy scrubbing their own hard drives. Hope, jagged and desperate, clawed at his throat. Maybe it was his appeal lawyer. Maybe there was a loophole. Maybe the nightmare was ending. He was shackled, patted down, and marched through a series of buzzing steel doors until he reached the visitation room. It was a long, sterile hallway, divided by thick plexiglass. He shuffled to the assigned booth, seat number 14. He sat down and looked up. The breath left his lungs in a painful rush. It wasn't a lawyer. It was Alice. But it wasn't the Alice he remembered. The mousy librarian in the cardigan was dead. The woman sitting on the other side of the glass was radiant. She wore a soft, oatmeal-colored cashmere sweater that looked expensive, but understated. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves around a face that had filled out, glowing with health and mountain air. She wasn't wearing makeup, yet she looked younger than she had on their wedding day. She watched him settle into the chair with an expression he couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pity. It was the way a scientist looks at a specimen in a jar. Richard picked up the heavy black phone receiver. His hand trembled. Alice picked up hers calmly. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was clear, lacking the tremor of fear that used to define their conversations. "You came," Richard whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "Why? To see the animal in the cage?" "No," Alice said. "I came because I'm closing the estate. There were some loose ends." Richard leaned forward, the old greed flickering like a dying ember. "Loose ends? You mean the assets? Did you find something else? Is there a way to get me out?" Alice shook her head slowly, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "You still don't get it, do you? You're still looking for the angle." "I'm looking for a lifeline, Alice. I'm in hell," Richard hissed, glancing nervously at the guard standing by the door. "Do you know what it's like in here? The food, the noise. I don't belong here." "You belong exactly where your actions put you," Alice said, her voice hardening just a fraction. "My father gathered the evidence, but you signed the checks, Richard. You made the deals." Richard slumped back. "Your father. The great Wild Bill. If I had known." "If you had known, you would have just tried to use him, too," she interrupted. "But we aren't here to talk about him. We're here to talk about the vault." The mention of the Blackwood repository made Richard's stomach twist. The gold. The $400 million he had let slip through his fingers, because he thought he was too smart for a worthless cabin. "What about it?" Richard spat. "Are you enjoying it? Did you buy a private island? A jet?" "I bet you did. You're just like me, Alice. You just pretend to be better." Alice reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document. She pressed it against the glass. "Read this." Richard squinted. His eyesight was failing, and the prison optometry services were terrible. He focused on the bold letters at the top. Certificate of Donation. Recipient, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Recipient, the Northwest Literacy Fund. Amount, 312,000 hastels. Liquidated gold assets. Richard's mouth fell open. He read the number again. $312 million. You sold it?" he choked out. "Every ounce," Alice said. "I kept enough to maintain the cabin and the land. The rest is gone." "You burned it," Richard screamed, standing up. The guard took a step forward, hand on his baton. Richard sat down quickly, hyperventilating. "Are you insane? That's power. That's freedom. You gave it away to charities?" "I didn't just give it away, Richard," Alice said, leaning in. Her eyes were intense now, locking onto his. "I gave it away in your name." Richard froze. "What?" "Look at the bottom line." Richard looked. Donor name, the Sterling Halloway Trust. I established a foundation, Alice explained calmly. The Richard Sterling Initiative for Legal Aid. We are currently funding the legal defense of 150 women in Washington state who are trapped in abusive, coercive marriages with wealthy men. We're hiring the best lawyers in the country to destroy ironclad prenups. Lawyers better than Jessica Vane. Richard felt the room spin. You used my money to fund divorces against men like me? I used my money, Alice corrected, to ensure that no woman ever has to feel as small as you made me feel. And the best part? The press loves it. They think you had a change of heart in prison. They're calling it your redemption arc. The Seattle Times ran a piece yesterday praising your newfound conscience. Richard looked like he was going to be sick. It was the ultimate punishment. She hadn't just taken his money. She had taken his identity. She had twisted his legacy of ruthlessness into a legacy of charity. He would go down in history not as a wolf, but as a benefactor. His shark friends would laugh at him. His reputation as a killer businessman was destroyed forever. "You're a monster," Richard whispered, tears of impotent rage spilling down his cheeks. "You planned this. This is vindictive." "It's justice," Alice said, standing up. "My father believed in keeping secrets. I believe in making statements." She looked at him one last time. The man who had controlled her, belittled her, and tried to discard her like trash. He looked so small now, so irrelevant. "Goodbye, Richard. I won't be visiting again. I have a life to live, and you're no longer part of it." "Wait!" Richard banged his fist weakly against the glass. "Alice, don't leave me here. I have nothing. Who am I if I'm not Richard Sterling?" Alice paused, her hand on the door. She looked back over her shoulder. "That's the question you should have asked yourself 10 years ago," she said. "Now, you have 15 years to figure it out." She hung up the phone. The line went dead. Alice walked out of the prison and into the blinding sunlight. The air tasted sweet, lacking the metallic tang of the visitation room. She walked across the parking lot, her boots crunching on the gravel. Leaning against a dusty, mud-splattered Jeep Wrangler was Ben. Ben wasn't a CEO, he wasn't a shark. He was the local veterinarian in the town near Blackwood Creek. He had calloused hands, laugh lines around his eyes, and he smelled like pine sawdust and antiseptic. When he saw Alice, he didn't check his watch. He pushed off the car and smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "You okay?" Ben asked, opening the door for her. Inside, Judge, now a full-grown, goofy golden retriever, barked happily and tried to lick Alice's face from the back seat. Alice paused, looking back at the grey fortress of the prison. She thought about the gold. She thought about the secrets on the servers she had wiped clean. She thought about the terror of sitting in that courtroom alone. She touched the silver locket around her neck. Veritas Vincit. "I'm better than okay," Alice said, climbing into the jeep. "I'm free." "Where to?" Ben asked, starting the engine. "Back to the cabin? The contractors said the new library wing is ready for inspection." Alice smiled, watching the prison disappear in the rearview mirror. "Let's take the long way home," she said. "I want to see the mountains." As they drove away, winding through the fir trees toward a life of quiet, meaningful purpose, Alice Sterling finally let the last ghost of her past fade away. She wasn't just the survivor of a bad marriage. She wasn't just the daughter of a spy. She was the author of her own story now, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't wait to turn the page. Richard Sterling spent his life building a monument to his own ego, believing that value was something you counted in a ledger, and power was something you exerted over others. He never understood that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting commands, but the one quietly observing, waiting for the right moment to strike. He lost his freedom, his fortune, and his legacy because he committed the fatal sin of arrogance. He mistook kindness for weakness and silence for stupidity. Alice didn't just win a divorce case, she dismantled a tyrant without ever raising her voice. She proved that the best revenge isn't just destroying your enemy, it's taking the very name they used to hurt you and turning it into a symbol of everything they hate. She turned Richard's greed into a lifeline for others, ensuring his legacy would be one of accidental charity. If this story of patience, justice, and the ultimate long game satisfied you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about karma coming to collect its debts with interest, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done with the contents of that vault? Kept the gold or destroyed the legacy? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.